annual, we're going to get to see the annual report from our 2020 data. And we all know that 2020 was not a very normal year. We didn't get quite the level of participation in sending in the data as we have in past years, but that data has all been compiled by Kansas and Kansas State, I should say, because then you might think I'm saying University of. And Allison Crowther is going to report out on this wonderful 2-page annual report. So Allison, would you show what you have found?
Okay, thanks, Belinda. So let's just dive into it. So just a little bit of background, if it will advance my slide. There we go. So the ASBO used to collect this data every year via paper and online forms, and then they would prepare this report for Congress. And the last time they prepared that report was with the 2011 to 2012 data. And then there was a lapse for a couple years. And then in 2016, the SBEEP started putting together this 2-page flyer that we have now. So the goals for this report and generally for the annual report, really the first thing is capture some key data that is relatively easy for states to provide or for programs to provide, but still helps us tell that story and give a good idea of what SBEEPs are and what they've been doing in the last year, and really get that kind of snapshot for people. So we used a dedicated annual report page on the National SBEEP website that has resources for programs to use. So there's a recorded training on how to collect and submit your information for the report. This is also, that page has the link to submit your information, as well as the previous reports. And then new this year, there was a fillable form PDF that programs could use to collect and organize their information before submitting it, and also for their own record keeping, so that they have a good way to keep that information that they collected and see in future years, okay, what did we do last year? So this year, Ohio hosted the data collection tool that we used, and we at Kansas took the lead on creating that flyer. And now we have this report prepared to help promote our programs. So getting into some of the, actually, I think I forgot, there's a poll. Nancy, can you launch that poll real quick? So if people could respond to that, and we'll give you just a few seconds to get your answers in. Okay, looks like most people have responded. If we want to go ahead and share that poll. So we've got right about 40% of programs or people here are using this to promote their programs. So that's good. So getting into the actual information we were collecting. So first off, we do start by asking if you are reporting on your state fiscal year or your calendar year. Either one is fine. It's just something to establish consistency. And then of course, asking state contact information. We ask for the budget that is dedicated to the SBEEP. Again, calendar year, fiscal year, either one is fine. Just like to know for consistency, or answering if you can't get that information, which can be an issue, especially sometimes with SBEEPs that are part of a larger organization, as they often are, usually are. to be able to isolate their budget from larger budgets within an organization. So then also total FTEs, so the full-time equivalent employees dedicated to SBO and SBEEP functions, a cap, whether you have one or an equivalent, and if you have one, whether or not it's active, where your program is housed. So a lot of that is environmental agencies, as we'll see, can also be in SBDCs, universities, a few other places. What media are covered. So all SBEEPs cover air. But getting into also what other media they cover. Contacts, so really that's getting into the assistance, the outreach offered, workshops and things like that that are meant to make contact and help small businesses. Web traffic, really the first thing is whether or not they have a website, and then page counts if they have them, which, as we know, was extra critical in 2020. Whether or not you use social media for your program, and if you do, what kind. Narrative, so this is where we're looking for quotes from small businesses or others involved, mostly from small businesses, and especially looking for case studies of work with small businesses. Evaluation, so that's where we're asking for some outcomes data, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well, but looking for environmental and compliance data and customer surveys, basically. And then one that we added this year, especially with the various impacts that 2020 had on all of us and on our work, we really wanted to ask about what challenges did you face and how did things happening affect your work differently, and especially this year, to try and capture some of that and to see, when we see changes, how much of that, how did being able to explain trends we see as, okay, so was that related to some of all of what was going on? So getting into response rates. So we had 34 programs from 34 states this year. Again, trending down a little bit, but pretty close to last year. And I think we expected to see a little bit of a dip, so not bad, really. And then getting into some of the answers that we saw. So first off, how many employees, FTE? And we've got the graph here. As you can see, the majority were under two FTE. And then one thing I did add for the presentation this year is I wanted to plot some of these over time and kind of see how they're changing over time. So, and again, keep in mind, this is with differences in reporting. So just keep that in mind as we go through. So here we're seeing the over 7 is holding steady pretty well. 5 to 7 hasn't accounted for much of it anyway. The 2 to 4 and the less than 2 are trending down. Note, though, that this is in absolute number of programs rather than percentage of programs reporting. So it's skewed a little bit by fewer programs reporting. And then also whether or not you have a cap or equivalent, whether or not it's active. And this has held pretty steady. We see that at least the last 3 years, the number of active caps has held pretty steady, and we're seeing no cap decreasing. Again, we're also seeing a downward trend in reporting, but at worst, this seems to mean that we're holding even on caps. So, all right, and then the next question was, where's the program housed? So the vast majority are within environmental agencies. And again, graphed it over time, I think most of the change we would see here is more variation in who's reporting from year to year. And then we have what technical assistance areas are covered. And again, holding pretty consistent. If anything, we're seeing kind of an uptick in other. So this year that included several things, such as storage storage tanks, mining, used tires, asbestos, and even financial assistance. And this year, 82% of programs are multimedia, so they offer at least one thing other than air. And that also has been trending upward. And then we have some of our activity counts, and I will highlight that this first one is on a logarithmic scale, so pay attention to the data labels there. And the reason for that is that mailings and publications tends to be a much larger category than the others. We saw that especially last year, but still you can see it's about 5 times the next one down. So I put it on logarithmic just because otherwise it doesn't always show up in a way that really tells you anything. And then, and this is outreach items. So if you sent out a mailer, even if you sent out 200 copies of it, that counts once here, and then here we're getting into audience. So that's where you count, if you sent out a mailer and it went to 200 people, that's 200. And then also getting into site visits, permit assistance, and other assistance offered, which we will get to a little bit more on the next slide, because I did want to break this one out a little bit actually and show it over time. So we can see permit assistance, we kind of saw trending up and then down in 2020. And that is kind of consistent from what we were seeing in the more narrative portions of the report, because people were saying, in some parts that their permits were down, or, a common thing was that they were restricted in site visits or couldn't do site visits at all for most of the year. And surprisingly, we didn't see that much of a downtick in site visits. And then other assistance, and this is one that I think can be a little inconsistent sometimes just because it's a bit of a catch-all. So I think that's why we saw a little bit more of a spike in 2019, but other than that, it's pretty consistent. So going to online resources. So the first question is, do you have a website? And this is one that we've seen a lot of change in over the years. As you can kind of see here, that upward trend. And as of this year, 94% of programs that responded for the annual report had websites. And then as far as total page views, so we do have more in the higher count brackets as far as total page views, which is good. It's an improvement. We also have fewer that are in the unknown page count or not applicable because they don't have a website, which is good to see, because that tells us that likely programs are getting a little more able to track their page views. And then another thing we ask about is social media use. So we've been seeing kind of an upward trend in social media use, which is good. This year, we didn't really see any new social media, because that's something that we kind of track from year to year. So what's maybe kind of up and coming. And the things that we saw mentioned this year that I don't think we've seen before were actually Constant Contact, which I think a fair number of people use, just don't always think of it as social media. And then radio, which I wouldn't necessarily consider social media, but I thought was really interesting that someone was using radio for their outreach. And then overall social media usage, I think we're seeing increase, but really the one that has stood out is this year we're seeing a lot more people using YouTube. Okay, and then getting into some of those more narrative outcome portions. So of the 34 programs that responded, 15 provided a narrative or a case study or quotes. So 6 of those provided case studies, and we saw those with different sectors in media. We saw some research in cannabis. One program was talking about their loan program. There was outreach with the dental amalgam rule that was going into effect. We saw wastewater assistance, and then of course was a permitting case study with a printer, and that's the one that actually went into the flyer. So, and just kind of some of the things that we look at when we're determining which case study we want to put into the flyer is we're looking for air related. Multimedia is good as well, but since air is the primary purview of SBEEPS, we want to make sure and showcase that. And then in line with that, we also want to make sure that they're involving small businesses. And we see a lot of interesting work that some of it is, that research that they're doing on emission factors with cannabis, or it might be outreach to regulators or working with regulators and advocating. But for the flyer, at least, we're trying to get cases of assisting small businesses. That doesn't mean we don't want the other case studies. We want to try and use them somewhere else, but just talking about kind of the criteria that we use in determining what goes into the flyer. And then it's always a bonus if it's something that includes metrics or that they're doing something beyond compliant. So if they're getting into maybe some P2 or other sustainability measures. And then we had 4 programs that submitted some outcomes data. And the outcomes data we get in kind of different formats, because sometimes we get survey results where it might be X% had a better understanding of their requirements, or had made some change toward compliance or toward sustainability, or had a better understanding of their regulatory requirements or more awareness of their emissions. Sometimes we get some financial information, so it might be either this much in a program, sometimes we get this much in a grants program or a loan program, or it might be savings. And then sometimes we get those environmental metrics that it's it was this many kilowatt hours, or metric ton CO2 equivalent, or tons VOCs, or something like that. And that, we like all of those. I think probably the main one we want to get is going to be those environmental metrics. And then the tricky part sometimes can also be trying to put those metrics together in a way to present, just because we do get them in those different formats that don't always work together to consolidate. Now, I don't think we included any this year, because again, with when we don't get that much and it's inconsistent, we can't really consolidate, so it's hard to present. I think we did do something last year that it was a little more like a snapshot from one program, because we had more last year. So, and then Nancy, let's go ahead and start the next poll before I go to the next slide. Is that okay? There we go. And if everyone can just take a few seconds and answer those 3 questions. All right, we'll give it just a few more seconds for anybody to finish up. All right, and let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results. Okay, so on how difficult is it for your program to assemble your data? The majority were somewhat easy, and then we had a lot neutral. So for those of you that found it kind of easy or actually found it kind of difficult, if you can just kind of be thinking about that, and maybe we can get some discussion going at the end here. And then did you use the fillable form to collect your information before submitting? So we saw about half. And that's of the people that were submitting, because we still had about 30% that said not applicable here. And then when you submit your data, do you keep track of it? 90% said yes, and that's great. Okay. Can we stop the share? Oh, that wasn't sharing, was it? All right. Sorry, I think I hit this button at the same time. All right, and I'll just leave that up for a second if anybody wants to look at that. Okay, and we'll stop sharing. And again, one thing that we wanted to cover this year was we wanted to ask about any challenges people were looking at to kind of see how this affected SBEEPS and how it would be affecting our data. So one common thing was staffing, which it tends to be a concern for SBEEPS and any time really, I think, but especially with the way COVID affected state budgets. We were seeing some of that. And another thing that came up a lot was transition to working from home. And we saw, a few people saying, we were already equipped for this, or we were already setting up something like this. So we were actually pretty well set up for this and the transition was smooth. And some saying it actually, it caused some problems, maybe in small businesses being able to access the SB, because as people went home, there might have been issues with communication lines as people weren't at their desks. So we saw some of that. And then also just some of the impacts of work during COVID. A lot said that site visits were restricted or they just weren't allowed to go on site. Some saw fewer calls. Again, some of that seemed to be issues with sometimes the transitioning to a work from home setup caused some issues with lines of communication. Some found fewer outreach opportunities because they couldn't go to trade shows and other in-person events. Some said that actually they were increasing their outreach to try and kind of make up some of the deficits that small businesses might be facing. And a few that were talking about converting some of their workshops into webinars so that people could still have that experience, and sometimes that even increased their audience. All right, so this is the 2020 report, also available on the website. So probably the biggest change aesthetically this year is we have a new logo. So we are incorporating the new logo into the report. And then there's been some reorganization that goes with that as well. So I think we will be creating a template from this for states to use. That hasn't happened yet, but I think we'll be doing that shortly, because I know that is something that we've had in the past for the report, just since we have changed the format a little bit with the new logo. I still left this in as an example of kind of some of the changes that can be made to adapt the flyer for use for a state program. Just because we don't have a new example quite yet with the new template, since that just came out, or since the new report just came out. Right, and then just kind of a couple fun facts to go through. So staffing ranges from 0.25 full-time equivalent in Georgia all the way up to 41 in California. Most programs do site visits. Again, some programs that normally do either didn't this past year or had their site visits drastically reduced. But we saw a range anywhere from one site visit, of course, for programs that do site visits, up to over 4,000. So the average budget that I calculated was 120,000 per full-time equivalent, with one caveat there is there were multiple programs that listed an FTE but didn't list a budget. So that's going to be a little bit skewed because this is only calculated based on the ones that listed a budget and an FTE. And then a few kind of examples of some of the larger programs there in terms of budget and FTE. And then still 19 programs are reporting a cap or equivalent. And that should be on the website. We try to keep those on the website. So if yours is not listed on the website, we would love to know and add some information for that if you have an active cap that's not listed. All right. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question on the site visits. I know people were looking into like doing virtual site visits. Do you know if that was part of the site visit number? I don't know if it really specified.
Yeah,
And that is
sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
definitely, no, that is
Okay.
definitely, we adjusted, I believe, the wording. And when Belinda presented, that was something that we definitely did include.
Okay, that's cool. Thanks.
It would be good to have, it would be good to have some parameters or have that metrics group meet again and really define things even further. That would be really good. That's kind of a wish list, but definitely with this past year, or in, when we do the 2021 one, it did include the virtuals.
Any other questions?
Just the one comment that Belinda made, she did prepare an Excel form. I was thinking it was on this site. I just don't think it got carried over to the new site. But that was a great idea to do too, just because then you could keep it for multiple years. So we'll have that up next year as well. Wisconsin was the group that put together the state template. And Lisa, do you guys still put together a state template? Or I was curious if any states are using the state template.
Yeah, yeah, I know Renee put something together.
Do any other states use it? The other thing I was going to mention, Allison, could you go back to slide 8? You did a great job putting all this together. Allison really loves stats, you could tell. So slide 8, and this is another area where if we had kind of that metrics committee, or if we expanded some of our definitions, for the mailing and publications, I think everyone knows that that's not just hard copy, right? That is electronic too. And so certainly I know in our program, we track electronic versus hard. And 80% of what we do, probably closer to 90% really, is going to be electronic. Are other states that way too?
This is Belinda, and I know that we did our last paper physical mailing back in 2018. So it is all electronic. And that might be something really interesting to consider, because we have such a big category here, and maybe next year we break that out into several different categories so we can actually start seeing some trends.
And I will say, you know, I shortened some of these from what they are in the form, just so they are a little bit easier to read on the graph, but I know there's more things listed in that category than just mailings and publications.
Right. I think that it might be interesting to see, number of print, number of electronic. Yeah, just differentiate that, because while we include it all, it might be interesting to see the differences of what the programs are and then track that over time. Because I think just like Massachusetts just said, they're not doing any more print as well. So that would be interesting to learn.
Right.
Well, Allison, thank you for all of your work for Kansas State, all that you've done putting this together. And Allison just put together a really excellent 2-page flyer that we can use to show what SBEEP is doing nationwide. So thank you.
Thank you.